Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelek Vav. We'll be learning today Mir Hashem Dav Dalid Amid Aleph. We're holding in the middle of Hilchas Chol HaMoed, and we begin today, top line, Dalid Amid Aleph, with a brand new Siman, Siman Tov Kuf Lav and Gimel, melachahs hamutarim b'chol HaMoed. Various melachas that you may perform that are mutter to do on Chol HaMoed, Ubai He Seifim, and here we have 5 Seifim. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, Mutter litchain kemach litzarech HaMoed. You are allowed to grind grain into flour on Chol HaMoed for the needs of the Moed. And you're allowed to do this even if it's a melachah, even if it's a Maisa Uman. Even if you're doing it in a professional manner, you're using professional machinery, and you're doing it in a professional way, you're still allowed to do that. We saw that earlier in the very first Mishnah Berurah in this volume, in Siman Tov Kuf Lamed Aleph, in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah said you're allowed to do Eichel Nefesh, Hainu L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh, you're allowed to do melachah for the purposes of Eichel Nefesh, for food that you need to eat. The mutter afilu maise uman. You're allowed to do that even if it's a maise uman. So you're allowed to grind your kemach into flour even if it's a maise uman. Says the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Katan Aleph, L'tzarech HaMoed. You're allowed to grind flour for the purposes, for the needs of the Yom Tov. She'ein like kemach bebeisai. You don't have flour. It's Chol HaMoed. You don't have flour. You want to bake bread. You could go ahead and you could grind flour. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Va'afilu yacha liknois oilishal mechaveroi. This is true even if you don't really have to grind flour. Really, you could go out to the store and you could purchase ready ground flour. Or you could go to your neighbor and you could borrow flour. Even if you have these options available to you, you're still allowed to do the melachah of tchina. You're still allowed to go ahead and grind the flour for Yom Tov. Ukidalakaman b'Siman Tov Kuf Lamed Zayin Sif Tes Vav. We see this later on in Siman Tov Kuf Lamed Zayin in Sif Tes Vav. And the words of the Mechaber over there are, Ve'im ein loy ma yochal, if somebody doesn't have food to eat, afilu moitze b'shuk liknois. Even if he has the ability to go out to the shuk, he has the ability to go out to the marketplace and purchase, ein matzrichin oisai liknois min hashuk. We do not require him to go out and buy from the marketplace. Ella, rather, kaitzer, he could harvest his own grain, or ma'amer, and he could gather up his grain, and it says over there he could do dash, he could do all of the melachas that are involved in food preparation, to use all of his own raw materials. Even though he's going to have to perform all of these melachas, he's not required to avoid performing those melachas by going out and purchasing ready-made food. He could do all of these melachas on his own raw material. And I know that there's a beer halacha, Tov Kuf Mem Beis. It's in Siman Tov Kuf Mem Beis. Siman Tov Kuf Mem Beis. If you want to see it inside, it's on Daf Yudalid Amid Aleph. So this is Siman Tov Kuf Mem Beis in Sif Beis. There's a beer halacha dibur amaschil al yidei poil. About almost all the way through this beer halacha. In my print, it's 3 lines off the end of the beer halacha. The sentence begins va'al karchach. He brings down over here from the Ritz Geos, a svara, v'chein kasav a Ritz Geos, da'al karchach ta'atam mipnei shesimchas ha'odam hu. The simcha, when does a person have simcha? Shenena mishal atzmai. He wants to gain benefit, he wants to have hanoah from his own resources. V'loi mituas acherim. He doesn't want to get from other people. V'lefikach hitter rav liktzer chitav. And this is why we give him a heter. He can go grind his own wheat, etc., etc. So this is, it seems, that it's more of a simchas Yom Tov to go ahead and use your own raw materials and use your own resources. You have all of these resources available to you. You don't want to go shopping and buy new what you don't need. So it's simchas Yom Tov and it's tzarech hamayid, and therefore this is mutter. All of this melachah is mutter, even if you have the ability to go purchase. Continues the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Katan Aleph. V'hu adin, the same halacha applies not only to the melachah of tchina, The gam share melachas yachal asos b'kigoyin zeh. You're also allowed to do other types of melachah to prepare food that you need for the moed. Tahainu kaitzer, you could harvest on Chol HaMoed to make food. Ubayrer, you could do the selection process. You could select out the grain from the chaff, etc. V'chamavur sham b'sif hanal, like we see in the sif that I just quoted to you before in Taf Kuf Lamed Zayin Sif Tes Vav. Okay, now we go back up to the top line of the Shulchan Aruch. Let's continue the words of the Mechaber. Afilu kivein melachah b'moed. Not only are you allowed to go ahead and grind your flour or harvest your wheat in order to prepare food for Chol HaMoed and for Yom Tov, but you're allowed to do this even if you purposely left over this melachah to be done on Chol HaMoed. So really, you could have gone ahead and you could have ground your wheat into flour before Yom Tov, but you didn't do it. You intentionally didn't do it. You said, you know what, I'll do it on Chol HaMoed. Even that is mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and base. Afilu kivein melachah. Ritzayin loymar. What the Mechaber wants to say here is, shahaya yachal l'sakein me'erev Yom Tov. You had the ability to do all of this malacha on erev Yom Tov. Umidaitoi hiniach darvazel asoisai b'chol HaMoed. And you intentionally, with forethought, you intentionally left over this malacha to be done on Chol HaMoed. That's still okay. Although the Bekama Mekaimais Machmerinon Bazeh, while we do find in other places that we're Machmir on something that was Efshar La'asaisai Ba'od Yom, if there was malacha that you were able to do before Yom Tov, sometimes we're not matir it. But over here with this malacha, it's mutter to do these malachas on Chol HaMoed, even though you absolutely could have done them before Yom Tov. When it comes to things that you're doing, nefesh, when it comes to malacha that you're doing for food preparation, we're not machmir, and although you could have done it before Yom Tov, you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Mechaber near the end of the top line. You're allowed to go ahead and chop wood. If you need to make a fire in order to bake bread, in order to put up a roast, you're allowed to go ahead and chop wood to fuel your fire. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and gimel. You're allowed to chop wood lahasik tanurei in order to fuel your fire. And the Sharetzion over here in Ois Cut and Gimel says v'gam bozeh, and over here also afilu kivein melachah b'moed. Even if you purposely, intentionally left this work to be done on Chol HaMoed, leslan ba, you're allowed to go ahead and do it. It's not a problem. Uchedemuchach mibeitza yutes amad aleph. Ukemoisha ramas hagra bebeurah. V'nizbaroid b'paiskim, and the paiskim explain to lagitiru lakaitzeitzim ela b'shetzarch lehem gufa. You're only allowed to chop the wood when you need the wood. Ava b'shetzarch raklin asiris aser. To chop wood because you only want a few chips for kindling, that you can't do. So the Mishnah Berurah said, "V'lakaitzeitzim lahasik tanura yichud Messiah b'seif v'ayin la'el b'simen tafka falav sifkat and ches b'Mishnah Berurah mashashayich l'nyanenu." Earlier in Chelik Hey in Siman Taf Aleph, we learned the question about if you have a big block of wood that you could burn to fuel your fire, but you don't really need such a big block of wood. You want to chop it up and just use small pieces. So we learned over there when it's permissible to do that and when it's not. Continues the Shulchan Aruch. Now we're on the second line. So far we said you're allowed to grind flour, you're allowed to chop wood to fuel your fire. Ulahatil sheichar, you're also allowed to set beer. You could go ahead and go into beer making. You want to prepare beer for Yom Tov, you could do it on Chol HaMoed. Ulahatil sheichar, bein shel tamarim, whether you're making date beer, bein shel sa'irim, or whether you're making barley beer, letzarech hamoed. If you're doing it letzarech hamoed, to enjoy it on Yom Tov, you're allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed. What's the difference between date beer and barley beer? Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Kat and Daled, bein shel sa'irim. You're even allowed to do this with barley beer, de'ika tircha meruba. By barley beer, there's a greater level of tircha preparing barley beer than there is date beer. I know that when you make beer out of barley, there's a lot of work that you have to do with the barley before you could set up the barley and the water to ferment. You have to prepare the barley first. I think there's a lot less complications when you're making date beer. So barley beer involves a tircha meruba, and we're going to see later in Siman Tavkov Lamed Zayin, we're going to see one of the categories of melachah that's mutter on Chol HaMoed is by a davar ha'avod. You're allowed to do melachah on Chol HaMoed in order to avoid significant financial loss. However, there are times that even though melachah for davar ha'avod is mutter, if it's a tircha meruba, it's not mutter. Over here, you're talking about oichel nefesh, you're talking about making beer. If you're making beer l'tzarech hamoed, you're even allowed to make barley beer, even though, like the Chavetz Chaim says, it is a tircha meruba. Continues the Mechaber, v'shaloi l'tzarech hamoed aser. But to go ahead and set beer shaloi l'tzarech hamoed, that's certainly you're not allowed to do any of these things. If you're not doing them l'tzarech hamoed, you're not allowed to do them. Continues the Mechaber, umiu ein tzarech litzamtzem ela oisa b'harvacha ve'im yoiser yoiser. However, when we say that you're not allowed to do malacha if it's not l'tzarech hamoed, that doesn't mean that when you're going to go ahead to grind flour, you have to look at your recipe and say, okay, I need a cup, so now I'm allowed to grind precisely 1 cup. It doesn't mean that if you're making beer, you have to say, all right, I'm having 9 guests, and me and my wife, it's 11 people. Figure we'll each have a glass of beer. Okay, I need 11 glasses of beer. No, you can make an amount. You don't have to be mitzamtzem. Oisa barvacha, you can make plenty. V'im yoiser yoiser, if you have leftover. Okay, so you'll have leftover. Aval, however, lo yarim litchain lasei shecher yoiser bekavana. However, you cannot engage in harama. You can't do a trickery over here where you're going to make a lot of beer or a lot of flour and you're making plenty of extra bekavana so that you should have leftover after Yom Tov. That you're not allowed to do. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and hay, aval lo yarim litchain. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'im bal hatachana einoi roitza litchain shir muat. Let's say you say to yourself, all right, I need approximately 5 pounds of flour. So you go to the fellow who has the mill and you bring him grain and you say, here's the grain, grind for me, I only need 5 pounds of flour. And the owner of the mill says, I'm not opening up the mill for 5 pounds of flour. It's not worth it for me. If you want me to grind flour, I do a minimum of 50 pounds. Okay, then you're allowed to do it. Yachal litchain afilo harbe. Then you're allowed to grind even 50 pounds. This is not harama. This is not that I'm grinding 50 pounds because I want to have extra leftover flour for the chayil. I want to have for after the moed. No. I'm going ahead and I'm grinding the other 45 pounds in order to have the 5 pounds that I need. This is similar to a svara that we learned earlier in Hilchas Yom Tov, where we said you're allowed to shecht an animal on Yom Tov, even if you only want a kizayis of basar. You want 1 steak, but you're allowed to go ahead and shecht the animal because you could only have the steak if you shecht the entire animal. You could only have the 5 pounds of flour if you grind the 50 pounds of flour. So then you're allowed to grind 50 pounds of flour. Ice cotton vav, the Mechaber said you can't do this harama. You can't go ahead and do trickery over here and make plenty of extra bekavana so that with intent that you should have leftovers after the moed. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton vav yoisa bekavana. V'im harim, if you did do harama, mutter b'di'eved, whatever you produced is mutter. Since you are using some of the flour that you ground or some of the beer that you set down, so the rest of it is mutter as well. However, if you look over there, according to the opinions that we had over there, that it's only when somebody did this b'mezid that we say the rest is mutter. Aval behe'erim, but we treat harama more stringently than a mezid. Aser af b'di'eved, and harama is aser af b'di'eved. Efsher dehu adin hacha aser. It could be that here also those opinions would hold that even b'di'eved, the product that you got from harama would be aser. Continues the Mechaber 3 lines off the bottom. So you're not allowed to do harama. Now the Mechaber describes another kind of harama you're not allowed to do. Let's say somebody has flour. He has plenty of flour in the house. He has beer in the house. Lo yarim lasois acher. He should not make a harama where he's going to go grind new flour or he's going to go set down new beer. V'yoymar, and he's going to say, Mizeh ani roitze. I want to use new beer. I want to use new flour. So the grinding that I'm doing now is Chol HaMoed. Yeah, I have flour in the house. I don't want to use that flour. I want to use fresh flour. Yeah, I have beer in the house. I want to put up a fresh batch. That's what I want. That's a harama. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here in Ois Cotton Zayin. V'yoymar mizani roitze. He's doing a harama. He's essentially preparing for after Yom Tov, but the excuse that he's using is, I want to put up a new batch because I want to use the new batch on Yom Tov. Even though he will partake of the new flour that he's grinding, this is still considered a harama, which is asur. Because he doesn't need it. He doesn't need it, so what's he doing it for? Continues the mechaber, avol, however, im yesh loy lechem, let's say somebody has bread in the house. Mutter litchain lepas, he could go ahead and he could grind new flour to make fresh bread. The pas chama odif, because everybody knows fresh bread is better. So, if you have a day-old loaf of rye bread in the house, and now you want to go ahead and you want to grind flour so that you could prepare a new batch of bread and have fresh bread, that's not harama. That's fine. You're allowed to do that because you're preparing fresh bread. Everybody knows fresh bread is better than day-old bread. V'hu adin, the Ramah says, the same halacha would apply b'sheichar when it comes to setting down new beer, im hechodosh adif beloy ha'arama. If the new beer is taka really better, beloy ha'arama, and you're not doing a harama, shari, then it's mutter. So the same svara applies to beer. You're allowed to go ahead and grind fresh flour to make fresh bread because fresh bread is better than day-old bread. You're also allowed to set down a fresh batch of beer if it's really true that the fresh batch of beer is going to be better than the old beer. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Ches. B'sheichar, the same halacha applies to beer. The same halacha also applies to grinding wheat or grinding barley in a similar situation. If you happen to have flour, but it's not great quality flour, and you want to go ahead and now on the moed, on Chol HaMoed, you want to go ahead and grind new flour that's of better quality, mutter litchain acherim sheyafim yaisamehem. You're allowed to go ahead and grind new wheat flour, new barley flour that's better than the one that you really have. That's not a harama. You're really preparing something better for Yom Tov. That's fine. Ice cotton test, if it's adif b'loy ha'arama, if it really honestly is better quality and it's not a harama. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, Shebe emes ha'chadash adif. That's what the words mean, that it's adif b'loy ha'arama, that it's better without ha'arama. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is, Shebe emes ha'chadash adif, that the new batch truthfully is better quality. Ve'ena miskavid l'harama. And what you're doing over here is not a haram at all. That's not what you're doing. V'dan, you should know, says the Chavetz Chaim, the yesh paiskim shesaimchem lahakel b'harama, the yesh la yashan v'omer b'sheicha chadash ani roitze v'shoyse gam min ha'chadash. He says that there are paiskim, and in the Sharetzian he brings this down from the Migdal Oiz, maybe he says that the Bach and the Chemin Moshe and the Pri Megadim also lean towards this opinion. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm quoting from the wrong Sharetzian. In Sharetzian, I was cutting Yud. The Magen Avram, the Eliyah Rabbah, the Chemin Moshe, the Nahar Shalom, the Migdal Oiz. Vedan, you should know the Yesh Paiskim, that there are Paiskim, Shesaimchim Lahakel, that rely on this Kula, Beha'arama, about employing this Harama, the Yesh La Yoshan, where somebody has an old batch of beer, and he says, I want a fresh batch of beer, and he drinks from the new batch. Ve'ein limchais l'misha roitza lismach hasfar zu. The Chavetz Chaim says you have choshev u'paiskim that are matir this harama, and he says you can't object to somebody who employs this kula. Nevertheless, yesha kasu, there are those that write the gam paiskim elu eina makilim, that even these paiskim aren't willing to be lenient. Ela bazeh de eina harama nikeres, only in a case where the harama is not obvious. Sheina kol yoidim sheish l'sheicher yasham, where people don't know that he has an old batch of beer. Avaloi b'toichin chitim, but not by grinding flour or oisa shecher or setting down beer. U'ma'arim lasis yoiser la'achar yomtiv, and we yamamish making a harama to have more for after yomtiv. Shahakol royin shu toichin harbe keder shu toichin b'choil. Everybody sees that you're growing and grinding flour the same way you always do during the rest of the year. So everybody sees that you're making a harama. That even these more kuladik opinions don't hold by that level of kula. Ois Katan Yud, the Ramah says it's mutter if it's not really a harama, if you're really making a new batch of beer because it really is a better batch of beer and you really do want fresh beer, then it's mutter. Kasav HaChayodim, the Chayodim writes, nearly it seems to me that afilu yesh lo pas nekia. Let's say somebody has beautiful white bread. Mutter lefais pas hadra l'tzarech Chol HaMoed. He could go ahead and he can make whole grain bread for the purposes of Chol HaMoed. Afagav de Yom Tov aser, even though on Yom Tov, if you have pastakia, you're not allowed to make pasadra, because you have pastakia, which is more chashuv. Why are you making pasadra? On Chol HaMoed, it's mutter. Ubelvad shetzarech al kol panim gam kein tzas b'moed, but you do have to eat from it on Chol HaMoed. V'isa b'arvacha, but you can make plenty. V'im yoiser, yoiser, and if you have extra, you'll have extra. Okay, again, a little bit of an abbreviated share, but we're going to stop here for today. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should stand in good stead for Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be Megan. Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should protect everyone. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas and Refuas to all those in need. And we should finally be Zeicha to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Be well.